who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. Good evening. It's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's October 26, 1980, and it's tape number 464 for those of you that receive the tape cassette or play this on other radio stations. Before I get in the middle of the program, I want to remind you again that if you write to me at Post Office Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93923, and send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll send you a bibliography of the program each week or selected weeks if you want. I have printed sheets that go out with the tapes by subscription, and if you want those, people locally or in Santa Cruz or Salinas, you can write to me and I'll send you the bibliography and references of the material that I'm talking about on each program. This evening I have just a few articles to refer to, and mostly I want to make some comments philosophically and ideas that I have about the election. 9 days from tomorrow is the next election for the President of the United States. And the program that I started years ago on KLRB 9 years ago, Dialogue Conspiracy, that became World Watchers, titled World Watchers later, has really to do with the electoral process. That is the subject that I have studied extensively, specifically the way candidates are chosen through murder, attempted murder, blackmail, and how they move into power on the basis of people that were murdered before them, and those murders haven't been investigated. I'm not going to pass great words of wisdom on either of the candidates, Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter, because I sincerely believe that each of those candidates is equally bad, and I have strong feelings now, I didn't have up till this week, about who I will be voting for. These tapes are numbered and dated and are preserved for all time, I hope, by some people. They put them away. And the subjects I talk on this program that I talk about are not momentary, such as particular quotations of Richard Nixon when he was in office, or Ronald Reagan, the candidate now who is governor of California, or Jimmy Carter. I give a few quotations of these men, but the main important thing about the candidates is the way they are used by the Defense Department and the intelligence agency and the news media as a front for something that is supposed to represent the people of the United States, but doesn't really represent their interests at all. We get deeper into debt, higher inflation, problems with cost of housing, food, transportation, health. Everything we need is being taken away from us. Clean air, food without poisons, and so forth. The problems are endless, and they get worse all the time, whether it is a Republican or a Democrat in office, because those people that are selected for us by the process of earlier murders that put them into office do not care about us as people. They care about corporations or power, or the power to make World War III, and we are expendable whether we are Democrats or Republicans. Jimmy Carter's had 4 years as a Democrat, and the fascism that rolled along after Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford has been continuous. Nothing much has changed. The names of the presidents and their parties go back and forth, but what they do affects our lives forever, and what they do is consistently bad and continuously leading us to World War III. What I talk about on these programs crosses party lines. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I try to look at the candidates and the strength they have and the weakness they have. And in this case, both of them are so closely linked to the assassination teams working in Washington, D.C. and around the world that there isn't a hair's breadth difference between them. We worry about Republicans being in office. The Democrats worry. John Kennedy was murdered when Democrats were in office. A Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, was accused by many people of murdering the president whose office he took. Democrats didn't investigate the murder. A Democratic Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, the brother of the dead president, didn't move his finger. A Democratic Senator, Edward Kennedy, didn't do a bit to help the people investigate who killed his brother Robert or his brother John. We had what we called a liberal Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who headed the Warren Commission. He was selected for political office by Murray Chotiner of organized crime. Earl Warren worked with Tom Dewey in New York. It was closely associated with the crime syndicate. And Earl Warren's career began when he was allegedly a suspect in the unsolved murder of his own father in Bakersfield. So that was your liberal Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and I fail to see any difference between a pseudo-fascist such as Warren Burger and an Earl Warren with his mistaken image of being liberal. My specialty and concern is the use of murder, as I say, political assassination, that controls our country, that every 4 years election year, and individually, whether they're single murders or whether they're mass murders, and all of those are taking place continuously. How do these 1980 candidates, Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, line up? As I said, there isn't a bit of difference between them. They both have close links to the Ku Klux Klan, to the Nazi Party, the young American Nazis in this country, to German Nazis who are still alive from World War II. They use Gestapo tactics that were taught to our Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Department by Hitler's agents. They're both heavily linked to organized crime, and they're up to their knees with agents who support them, who are heavily involved in narcotic traffic all over the world. And with narcotic traffic goes burglaries and robberies and keeps us off the streets at night and mugging. And the profits from heroin and cocaine and hashish go into the pockets of the politicians, and then we get more police on the streets, and the police get paid off, and there's a vicious cycle, and the narcotic traffic continues. In terms of assassinations, Ronald Reagan has been funded by people, teams in Texas, Florida, Georgia, that were involved in the murder of John Kennedy, linked to the H.L. Hunt, John Connolly, Leon Jaworski, Clint Murchison, the John Birch Society. The radical right that were behind the murders of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King are behind Ronald Reagan right now. And when he was on the Rockefeller Commission in 1975 to investigate CIA activities within the United States, which included the political assassinations, he covered that up completely. Jimmy Carter works with terrorists. He sends his brother Billy and Mr. Brzezinski to George Habash over with the PLO, and with Carlos in Tripoli, and with Gaddafi, and the most violent anti-Semitic terrorists that are bombing, killing, maiming all over the world, from London, United States, South Africa, Middle East. The links of the Carter family are endless and are turning up more every day in the newspaper, with investigations that will maybe open after the elections, but are being, the lid is put on them right now. And Jimmy Carter in Georgia is linked to gun running, organized crime, the CIA, the Middle East connections to South Africa, Asia, and mass murderers. His headquarters in Georgia and his family and his agents today are heavily associated with people like Robert Vesco, who also works with Ronald Reagan's team. I keep saying Nix, with Ronald Reagan's team. And there isn't a hairbreadth difference between Vesco working with Carter's or Vesco working with Reagan. I really don't see any difference. There were mass murders in Germany, studying history, at the end of World War I that are important. A friend of mine loaned me some pages of a book that she had, and we'll have to locate a used bookstore, some quotations from a book by Otto Frederick called Before the Deluge, A Portrait of Berlin in the 1920s. This is a book about murders in Germany before Adolf Hitler came into power. There was a period from 1920 to 1933 where there were continuous murders in Germany, political murders, to make way for Adolf Hitler. So you can't blame Adolf Hitler for everything that happened bad in Europe after World War II. He wasn't in power those 13 years when these murders were taking place. Some people were maimed and blown up. Other people were beaten to death. Most of the victims were liberal. Many of them were Jews. And there was a knowledge among these people, according to this book, that a general knowledge that the bureaucrats in the police department and the judiciary had very little interest in punishing these assassins. This was verified by another book by Seymour Melman that came out on the assassinations in Germany. And Emil J. Gumbel printed part of this book, 4 Years of Political Murder, in 1922. This is another book that's hard to get, in which Gumbel talks about 354 political murders committed by the right wing in Germany in this 13-year period, particularly not in a broad period, just 4 years after the war, from 1918 to 1922. 22 of those murders were committed by the left-wing group out of 354, and of the 22 murders of the left wing, 17 got heavy sentences and 10 were executed. Of the 326 remaining done by the right wing, they got 4 months in jail for 326 murders. The sentence was 4 months in jail. And the book Before the Deluge confirms the book 4 Years of Political Murder in Germany. And this Otto Frederick makes comparisons to the Kennedy assassination in his book, that they had the same problem in Germany when one of the leaders in Germany was murdered. A man named Walter Rathenau was murdered, a public servant who worked in Germany, and he was murdered in 1922. And they described his death and the effect that the murder had in 1922, that when this foreign minister was killed by a group called the Free Group in Germany, it brought on a horror that was similar, this author says, to the death of John Kennedy in the United States. And he says that when Walter Rathenau was assassinated, it was the beginning of the end of German Jewry. This was in 1922. The handwriting was on the wall for what would happen after 1933. So the intellectual Jew, the university people, the Gentile historians, the politicians, all were silent while these continuous murders of political people took place. And they listed in this book the story of Before the Deluge, different murders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and another man, Matthias Erzberger, the finance minister. He was the man who signed the armistice at the end of World War I. He was shot in a forest somewhere. And Woodrow Wilson, who went for the Versailles Treaty, was poisoned. And there are documents that I've had on previous tapes and broadcasts, the question, should we kill him instantly or let him die slowly? And Woodrow Wilson was poisoned and died slowly when he returned home to the United States. From the moment the Versailles Treaty was signed, there was an intent by a group of people to start a continuous murder of people who wanted to coexist with the Soviet Union or have peace. This group was hell-bent on having war. In another book I have on this subject, they describe these men that killed Rathenau as the men whom war will never let go, who always will have war in their blood. This is a book, The Order of the Death's Head, by Heinz Hohn, published in 1970. So the people that killed Walter Rathenau formed the SS with Himmler. From that time on, in 1922, they were already organizing. But where were the people, and what did they expect would happen to them? And the same question comes about now after the death of John Kennedy. Where are the people that should have spoken up about all the evidence of a conspiracy? And has that silence been indicative of the power that the government has to do other murders and get away with it? And we are going someday to have to pay our dues for turning our back on the perfectly obvious fact that hundreds of people have been murdered in this country for political reasons. And if we had time, I'd read off some of the names, and maybe I will in a few minutes. There is no candidate in 1980 who speaks about peace. That is a dirty word. There's no candidate who wants to coexist and trade with all countries. They want to arm China to fight Russia, arm the Middle East to fight each other. These candidates are simply for selling weapons to whoever wants to buy them and hoping they don't hit us but just wipe out each other. It won't work that way any more than it did selling scrap metal to Japan for years before Pearl Harbor came down. I'm not pessimistic about the condition of the United States and what's taking place for a simple reason. I accept the situation for the world as it is. I try to change it if I can, but I refuse to get frustrated if people are apathetic or opportunistic, trying to take advantage of what's good and not making effort to make any change. If I worked myself to the grind and expected a reasonable number of people to wake up and take arms, and they didn't, I'd be disappointed. But if I don't expect that to happen, if I know that reasonable people are very few, that you can just count on a few fingers, then I don't expect anything and nothing much from the victims, the future victims. I'm not expecting them to react any differently than they did in Germany or Italy or France or any other country. Victims don't know they're victims until they're about to die or at the moment of death. I do my work. I try to lay down certain facts that are based upon history to show where we're going. And hopefully, when things get really rough and tough, you might remember some of the things I said and be able to make a judgment based on other than emotion or laziness, and remember that whatever comes down had a beginning and an end, that it didn't just happen. You don't just wake up and have acid rain or fallout from bombs from China or radiation or sterilization. You have it because people brought in scientists to reap the benefit and profit from that invention, knowing that your body will have those diseases, and they don't care about you. And so long as you allow the scientists to do the genetic research today, the DNA, the test tube processes of creating super races and high IQs and so forth, you're going to have to live with the consequence of the complacency. Now, the Constitution of the United States was written for reasonable or normal conditions, but there was no provision in the Constitution, and I reread it again this week to check that out, for when one president succeeds another and there's a suspicion that the vice president had the president murdered. There should have been a clause that in the case of an election when a president is murdered and the man who was the vice president under him has links or is suspect to that murder, that the election should be put off until the investigation takes place of the assassins and the vice president who would succeed the man who was killed. Our Constitution says the president must be a natural-born citizen, 35 years of age, 14 years residence in the United States. But it also says something interesting, too. It says, Congress may by law provide the case of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall act as president, and as such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed or a president be elected. In the case that a president is removed from office, Congress shall act accordingly about the disability until a president is elected. Now, it seems to me that Congress should take its time when a president is murdered or out of office to decide about the qualifications of the vice president. And the way I read the Constitution, it seems that Congress should make the decision. When John Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, Texas at 12:55 Central Time, Lyndon Johnson was made president at 2:38 Central Time. So 2 hours and 20 minutes after the murder of John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson was sworn into office by Sarah Jane Hughes, a friend of his, Sarah Hughes, of the Central Intelligence Agency, a CIA woman and a judge who's still presiding in Texas. And within 2 hours, Lyndon Johnson had himself made president of the United States. After that, Gerald Ford was put on the Warren Commission by Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon had lost the presidency to John Kennedy in 1960. I follow the past assassinations, and I believe sincerely that the election process has been a fraud since 1960. You go up and you put an X after two names that they selected for you, or one of those independents that's a sure loser. The election should have been stopped in 1964, or certainly the oath of office of Lyndon Johnson may be put off and another president appointed, given the circumstances that Lyndon Johnson came from Texas and worked so closely with the Dallas law enforcement, the government, the group that was to investigate the murder. No person of the CIA should have handled the evidence, and they handled all of it, because John Kennedy had kicked Allen Dulles out of the CIA because there was a hidden government behind his back. Law officers from around the world should have been able to examine the bullets, the autopsy x-rays, the clothing of John Kennedy, of John Connally, instead of it being locked up or sent to the dry cleaners or destroyed. And there should have been an investigation of Jack Ruby and his connections to organized crime, or Richard Nixon, or the House Internal Security Committee, or the employment of Lee Harvey Oswald at Riley Coffee Company, a conduit of Mullen Associates in Washington, D.C., and the links of Carlos Marcellos, a organized crime figure with connections to Jack Ruby in Las Vegas, and Mo Dalitz and Robert Vesco and the assassination teams. No president should have taken office or have been elected in 1964 without finding out how the man who preceded him was murdered. Again, in 1968, Richard Nixon shouldn't have been allowed to run for president of the United States until all the evidence of how Senator Robert Kennedy was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel was examined, to find out without any doubt whether Nixon and his White House plumbers and his dirty team and the CIA had killed his opponent in order not to have this fair election. They should have gone into the Ambassador Hotel and counted the bullets. There were 10 the police and FBI had, and Sirhan's gun shoots 8. They should have questioned Mr. Shine, who owns the Ambassador Hotel. He worked with McCarthy and Roy Cohn in the House Un-American Activities. During the Big Red Scare, he was part of the team that escalated Richard Nixon's prominence, David Shine. They should have gone into the weapon that Sirhan had, who he was with the days before he ended up in the Ambassador Hotel, his state of mind when he was under hypnosis, the links of the Sirhan family in Pasadena to the Central Intelligence Agency in Palestine. They should have found out who brought over the Sirhan family and the conduit of the Greek Orthodox Church. There shouldn't have been an election in 1968 until we found out if one of the two candidates who won the primary victory in June of 1968 was murdered in order to assure Richard Nixon's nomination for President of the United States. Before the 1968 elections, they should have gone into Martin Luther King's murder that took place in April of 1968. James Earl Ray called a CIA attorney from London, Mr. Haynes, when he was picked up there. He gave interviews that murder of Martin Luther King had to happen during an election year. What followed were riots that catapulted Spiro Agnew, who had links to the Nazis in Greece, who was part of the military junta that put Nazis back in power in 1967 in Greece. Tom Pappas and the CIA and the Akros and the oil people. Agnew wasn't qualified to represent the people of the United States. His combined organized crime and CIA and Greek fascist connections and the shenanigans that went on in Maryland when he was the governor, the elections should have been called off. There's nothing in the Constitution that provided for this kind of chicanery that we have lived with and put up with. And the point is that in Germany, they lived with that from 1918 to 1933 when Hitler came in. And when they got Hitler, they got more than they bargained for, but their lethargy brought Hitler. Those 326 deaths of the left made Hitler possible. There was no one to speak up for the people. And that's what happened in this country. In 1969, Tony Lasowitz of the Watergate fame was up at Chappaquiddick. E. Howard Hunt was working on Chappaquiddick. Nixon was going to run against Ted Kennedy in 1972. The truth about how Ted Kennedy got to the island, who he called, how he got back, is all a lie. The Chappaquiddick witnesses were never called before a court. Mary Jo Kopechne never deserved an autopsy. There was blood on her blouse, and they never found out how it got there. The damage on the car wasn't consistent with the way it fell in the water. All that happened at Chappaquiddick was that every person in the cottage was flown away. There was a wall of silence. There were discrepancies and lies. Nixon's plumbers were up to their ears in the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne. It all began to come out at the time of Watergate and was hushed up like the Otto John case in Germany. And the whole purpose was to keep Ted Kennedy from running in 1972. And there never should have been an election in 1972 after the Watergate entries in June and the Chappaquiddick affair until every question about who murdered Mary Jo surfaced to find out if the Republicans had murdered Mary Jo Kopechne to make sure that Richard Nixon would be reelected. Now, this isn't a Republican problem that Richard Nixon won because Robert Kennedy was dead, or that Richard Nixon won because Ted Kennedy was embarrassed and washed out, or wasn't even in the car. The true story of Chappaquiddick never came out. That isn't a Republican problem. They can pull those shenanigans just as the Germans pulled their 326 murders or more in Germany prior to Adolf Hitler. The problem is with the lazy Democrats. They can't get off their behinds and even ask what happens to their fallen leaders or their candidates. And half of them belong to the intelligence community, and when the deaths take place, they scramble like mad. People like Burke Marshall and Ramsey Clark and Mr. Kunstler and the so-called left, or Mark Lane. There is no left. There's no left lawyers. There's a bunch of cowards that run and publish maybe one or two books and leave it go at that and betray their very friends right down the line. The election should have been stopped, as I say, at the time of Watergate. And when Nixon was in power, he won the election in spite of all the damage or the evidence that the Watergate went all the way to the White House. And when Richard Nixon went out of office, he appointed Gerald Ford, again, not qualified to be president of the United States, a member of the Warren Commission who covered up the assassination of John Kennedy, and then becomes president of the United States on the condition Nixon says, I'll make you the president of the United States, and you promise that I can't be prosecuted for any further offenses. So Gerald Ford makes that deal, and you call that a presidency. Gerald Ford was on the Meet the Press, or one of the shows last week, as if he were a distinguished elder statesman talking about my presidency. He was elected to nothing. He's represented the CIA and the Defense Department. He's lied through his teeth about Lee Harvey Oswald and the assassination of Kennedy and all other intelligence operations. He absolves Richard Nixon of any crimes when he had so many crimes on the book, including the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt, the death of Murray Chotiner. There were many, many Watergate deaths that just flowed one after the other. Lou Russell and many witnesses to the Watergate story, Beverly Kay in the White House, who typed up the 18-minute tape and so forth, or had access to it. The deaths were countless. And Gerald Ford just steps right in, and Nixon goes to his beach home and sells it at a big profit and ends up a next-door neighbor to David Rockefeller right in Manhattan, as cozy as he can be. And the 1980 election rolls around, and they had a convention, the Republicans, and not a word about how Nelson Rockefeller was deep sixth. Would Ronald Reagan be candidate if Rockefeller were alive today? Rockefeller would certainly bring out some issues. I believe not that he was perfect, but he conveniently was deep sixth before he was a thorn in Reagan's side. This is the end. I'll stop now so we can turn the tape over. This is 30 minutes of election murders and conspiracies and why I have little faith in the system. We'll continue in another moment. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
I'm so anxious.
You're listening to Mae Brussell and World Watchers International for KLRB, Carmel by the Sea. And now, back to Mae Brussell.
Okay, now for the second half of my election analysis. Many of you who get this tape, the elections will just about be over by the time it's mailed to you, and either candidate, Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, either one that wins, doesn't affect much the human condition unless you want it to change. Nothing is going to happen through Jimmy Carter that would be any different than Ronald Reagan. The style may be a little bit different, but the complacency that you would have under Jimmy Carter is a false complacency, and for that reason, I'm going to discuss the reason I believe that I personally am going to vote for Ronald Reagan. Just before I do that, I do want to mention that when Nelson Rockefeller had his heart attack in New York City, he was with a Megan Marshak from California, and in came Poichena Pierce, a friend of hers from New York, who called the ambulance. There was a David Lustig from California, from Reagan Country, attending and working with Nelson Rockefeller, who was engaged to Megan Marshak. Dr. Ernest Esikoff from South Africa and Andrew Hoffman, the aide to Nelson Rockefeller, were never questioned. This was an outright murder of Nelson Rockefeller at a time of possible links of Guyana to Venezuela, where Rockefeller has strong hold of the oil company at Caracas, and mind control experiments going on in Venezuelan prison systems. And also there was a drug war, is a faction going on between the Rockefeller Combine and the Western Group, and Donald Donaldson had disappeared and died, and had mentioned Nelson Rockefeller as being behind the Kennedy assassination, and George de Mohrenschildt had died, a close contact of Nelson Rockefeller, and John Paisley, also working with the intelligence system, had died. And all of these deaths, the Jonestown, the Paisley, de Mohrenschildt, Donaldson, and Rockefeller, a ball of wax where all of them were wiped up and all had very much in common, and none of these people were ever called. There was never an inquest, an investigation, and as soon as Rockefeller was out, New York belonged to Ronald Reagan. Well, I was at a lovely dinner party last night, and all of the people there were against Ronald Reagan, and I believe I shocked them by stating that I believe I have to vote for Ronald Reagan. Some of you may be surprised at what I'm saying, and I have vacillated for many, many weeks about this election. I believe there were two articles in the newspaper this past week that tipped the scales for me on the decision to vote for Ronald Reagan, and the two of them I will go into at great length next week, the details of these articles. One has to do with Billy Carter in Libya and working with Yasser Arafat of the PLO and meeting with George Habash, the Palestinian leader. I have too much information about George Habash, about Georgia, about the assassination teams, the men that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, that worked with Congressman McDonald and worked from Georgia, to ever sit back and believe now, after all the information of Vesco and Billy Carter and his meetings with these people, that the Georgia connections are as deep as I really didn't want to believe when Jimmy Carter first came in. But I do believe that the connections of Jimmy Carter to the assassination teams are very long-standing and deep. And the other article, there was a two-part on the same subject, one from the London Times, August 31st, 1980, and an article by Maxine Cheshire in the Washington Post. The title of one article in the London Times has to do with, it's called The Bank, the CIA, Heroin, and Murder, and also on the second page, 12 Missing or Dead. And then Maxine Cheshire had an article in the Washington Post, The Murdered Banker's White House Connections. Now, these articles are about a Mr. and Mrs. Wilson who were shot in New Zealand, who are heroin traffickers who work for the CIA, a bank called the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, that's a Central Intelligence Agency bank. There's missing hundreds of $20-30 million at least from the bank. It has to do with Hamilton Jordan, Jimmy Carter's buddy, Trujillo's in Panama, and the 12 murders connected to this particular bank in Australia linked to John Paisley of the Central Intelligence Agency, who worked with Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in the Soviet Union, and a man, Walt McDonald of the CIA, who works with William Colby, and the heroin trade and the assassination teams, the drug traffic, the Carter connections are so deep. This article from the London Times is a ball of wax that I'll go into more in detail. But the more I read about Jimmy Carter and his links to Vesco and these assassination teams and his inaction as president, he came on saying that he would have truth and open up files, and yet while he was president, these various people, primary witnesses to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, were murdered. The conclusion of the committee was that Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed. John Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed by conspiracies. The President of the United States has kept quiet. G. Robert Blakey said that he could prosecute, or the Justice Department could prosecute some of the assassins now. Jimmy Carter hasn't done that. I believe sincerely that both of these men, Reagan and Carter, are so involved in the multiple assassinations that have taken place in the past that the reason I'm voting for Reagan is that we're too complacent under Jimmy Carter. And when you get Ronald Reagan, you will get as angry and nervous and concerned as I have been through the years. You've had a lot of time to be complacent. Well, I've been concerned. And I don't think that voting for Ronald Reagan will put you to sleep. Whoever you are, when you need help and you see things coming down you and you're breathing foul air and foul water on your brink of war, and so you can't have abortions, and the death penalty is reinstated, and there's rioting and Klan and Nazis and terrorism in the streets, you will be forced to get away from whatever you're doing and begin to meet with people and discuss whether you're going to stay alive or whether you're dead already, because Ronald Reagan is going to force you to think about things you haven't wanted to think about when Jimmy Carter was in office. Reagan will awaken the Jews and the black and the Chicanos and the poor and the anti-war and the anti-pollution and the pro-abortion and the anti-death penalty, and they'll wake up from their long sleep since the Vietnam War. You may get mad at some of the issues that people talk about, but you're going to express your anger. I don't think you're going to sit around and be as complacent as you were in the past. The trends since World War I are becoming apparent. We're arming the entire world, and weapons are going to start flying pretty soon back and forth, more than Iraq, Iran. And when Ronald Reagan is president of the United States, he will give that Pentagon every penny they want until he bankrupts you so badly and takes from you what you need that you will get out in the streets and scream and organize and demand your rights back again. You've given them away piece by piece under Lyndon Johnson and under Jimmy Carter. Complacent, you woke up, or we woke up when Richard Nixon was in office. When he was in office, we discovered about the COINTEL program, about the plans to wiretap and bug and illegal entries into homes and the MK Ultra and the drug programs. That came because Nixon was in office, not because a Democrat was in office. You have to get it really bad before you get some truth. People are expendable under Ronald Reagan. His mind control programs were rampant when he was governor. They're without breaks with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter doesn't care what happened in Jonestown to those people. He protects the mass murderers. He's protecting the people that are killing the blacks in this country right now. He's not making any effort to stop these kinds of deaths, and I believe that Ronald Reagan will encourage the far right, and then the left, or whatever it is, there is no left, but say people, will wake up and rally. When Reagan gives the go-ahead, and his police force and his team look the other way, as they did in Germany, maybe Americans will wake up. Maybe they won't. They didn't in Germany, but there was an example to live up to of the consequences. Any control from inflation, you're going to have to get from Ronald Reagan. He's going to tell you how to solve the problem of inflation. We didn't get it with Jimmy Carter. We get more medical costs, more costs for drugs, more transportation. Education's going to cost more. Housing is going to cost more. food and necessities, but you're getting a creeping kind of fascism under Carter, whereas Reagan is so flagrant. His speeches and his idiocy, his remarks like, if you've seen one tree, you've seen them all, and if there's going to be a bloodbath, let it be. That's when the students got mad, and Ronald Reagan wanted to confront them, and maybe he'll shoot one or two, but for every one he shoots, there'll be 30 or 40,000 organizing. You've got to get out there and express your anger, and if you don't think there's something to be angry about now, you will when Reagan's president. The poor and the middle class will, they'll be pushed aside. Reagan loves that. He'll tell the children to go to trade schools or live in trailers or stay home and work hard if you can, get a job and pay taxes and take minimum wages, and the elderly and the uneducated and crippled, the mentally sick are expendable. But you won't like that if members of your family are treated that way, and you will speak up to them. They're being pushed against the wall right now, but nobody is saying anything. With Reagan, it's visible. Ronald Reagan is like Disneyland. I was talking to a friend about that this week. He's a symbol. His symbol, is, wherever he goes, are balloons and jelly beans. He wants to bring you back. Be happy. Look how pretty they are. They're pink and blue, and they're pastels, and they're red, white, and blue. And balloons mean childhood and fun, but balloons also mean disappointment. They pop on the way home. You come home from the shoe store, and my children cried. Hit the carpet, the balloon popped. Their brother or sister popped it. Balloons weren't always that much fun. They didn't last, and they were so temporary. And they're very pretty and gay, but they break, and children don't like that either. And jelly beans aren't so much fun. That's Reagan's symbol, his jelly beans. Jelly beans are slow to rot your teeth. They taste good when they go down, and years later your teeth are rotted, and that's what Ronald Reagan is. He's all jelly beans and balloons. And like Disneyland, it's not a city. I did radio tapes on that before. It's a computerized village with sets and a computerized Abraham Lincoln giving a speech. It's nothing at all. It has no substance. But if you want to know about Ronald Reagan, get your jelly beans and get your balloons and that senile old goat and put him up there and then look at him. And look at him good, because the same people pushing him are pushing Carter. David Rockefeller and Brzezinski are pushing Jimmy Carter the same way, but Carter has things together on the surface, so it isn't as noticeable as it will be if Ronald Reagan is president. Wait till he invades Cuba. The third world and other countries will come down on us. There was a demonstration in Great Britain. It was on 60 Minutes this evening. Many of you probably saw it. Anti-war people, they don't want our nuclear warheads on their country. They say the United States won't be affected again. All of a sudden, in October of 1980, the British caught on that they may have World War III in their backyard. And the commentator on 60 Minutes went on to say that these aren't the hippies or the anti-war people. Isn't it strange? This is the middle class coming out. Well, that's why if I vote for Reagan and enough people vote for Reagan, we'll get the middle class out of their chairs. We'll get you away from your television set and your complacency and the People magazine and all the trivia, because you won't have time for trivia when the warheads start being distributed around the country and begin to leak and we have more 3 Mile Islands. Other countries are nervous now as we get close to Reagan time. They're beginning to wake up and seeing what we're putting over there on their soil, and Europe isn't liking it very much. When Reagan's in, the military dictatorships will come out full glory. You'll see South Africa and Argentina and Taiwan and Brazil, Saudi Arabia being proud as peacocks, and they will display themselves as the Shah of Iran displayed himself when Richard Nixon was in office. But it wasn't Jimmy Carter over at the Shah telling him what a great person he was and the mainstay of peace in the world. So bring these people out. The higher they climb, the sooner they'll fall. Saudi Arabia has to have a revolution someday with its slave labor camps. Brazil and Argentina and South Africa can't stay the way they are forever. So bring out Ronald Reagan and you'll get revolution and a change of hands in these governments. I'm tired of seeing these countries destroyed from the inside and people around the world believing that there's a semblance of a decency. Under Jimmy Carter, didn't we get, after the president of South Korea was murdered, a man who is a fascist equal to any of the rulers of the world today, a bloody fascist? Let him be anointed and let Ronald Reagan recognize South Korea and let him kill his opponent and hang him, and North Korea and China and Russia will come zooming down on us and say, you can't do that. Daniel Ludwig can come out of hiding in Brazil when Ronald Reagan is president. He continues to make his paper and his pulp so that someday when all the other printers and books dry up, Daniel Ludwig, the hidden man, it's hard to describe this multinational, international creep from Michigan, protege probably of Gerald Ford and Henry Ford, the Michigan fascist team, who settled on land that Henry Ford had in Brazil and kills off natives to build his huge town there. When he dies, he's going to leave the money to cancer research in Switzerland, not to the United States. And when he builds a paper pulp empire, he brings the entire assembly from Japan. He doesn't even use American labor. Daniel Ludwig is the ilk that works with Reagan, and he can come out of the woodwork and we can see his face, maybe. Cancer and diseases will escalate, but they escalated under Jimmy Carter. Wasn't it Jimmy Carter that allowed Dow Chemical to be paid? Dow Chemical paid $43 million to the Mexican government to put paraquat in marijuana. That wasn't the cost of the Dow Chemical that Rockefeller makes. That's what they paid Mexico to kill young people on the West Coast particularly. A few years later, they'll have lung cancer. If you were 18 to 30 years old and lived on the West Coast during Carter's administration, the chances are that you're as likely to get cancer of the lung 15 years now as if you were a child who was brought up teething on a crib with lead paint who gets cancer 20 or 30 years later from the lead paint. Jimmy Carter allowed youth, potential anti-war people or protesters or dropouts, people taking marijuana, to be poisoned purposely. So where were the hippies? Where were the anti-war people? Where were the marijuana smokers? Home, complacent, lighting their joints, sitting back. Wait till they get lung cancer. They'll scream like a bunch of little piggies, like in Utah, where people allowed atomic testing from Nevada. They allowed it in Utah. The sheep were dying. Vegetation was dying. The government said, no leaks of atomic bombs here. Now they're screaming and yelling. They've got leukemia. They're suing the government. Many of them are dying of that. They're dying of Agent Orange from Southeast Asia. Dow Chemical told them it was poison before they used it. They knew it as early as 1962. Now they're suing and now they're screaming. I don't know why the complacency before, but I'm absolutely convinced that when you get a Ronald Reagan, as I say, you'll get off your chairs really fast, much faster than you would if you had Jimmy Carter for president. You'll see diseases escalate. The germ control centers in Georgia, and that's Georgia territory. We see new diseases, strange diseases like Legionnaires, unexplained diseases. There'll be more of that, and there'll be famines, and they'll continue to wipe out large masses of people. And Ronald Reagan won't be any different than Jimmy Carter with the Cambodia situation. He will allow the famines, but he'll do it in a way that you're going to notice it. And you're going to notice who he recognizes and who he deals with. His special agents are also lobbyists for Taiwan and South Africa and all the fascist countries. And when you get a president who is so grossly fascist, you are forced either to give up totally and say, okay, you win, Adolf, we give it to you, or no, we're going to fight. You're either going to get the resistance the Americans had at the time of the American Revolution, where you get back to a government by the people and for the people, or the French Revolution, where you're not even eating cake anymore and you're begging for crumbs and eating your cat and dog food. You're going to wake up. Or the Russian Revolution, when the Tsar was kicked out, the people got together and had conversation and found ways to overthrow fascism in that form. I don't have any easy solution. I know that we don't use the methods that are available to us now. We don't challenge the candidates. Enough people don't get on talk shows and radio shows. They don't write letters to the editor. They don't write to the chemical companies. They're not boycotting these companies. You're going to have to think of some alternatives, and you're going to have to act in order to stay alive. And I think that Ronald Reagan will do it more than anybody else. There's one man in Texas, I've mentioned him before, Charles Spears, who collects the names of people that have been murdered, such as in Germany during the period of 1918 to 1933. He collects the names of people that have been murdered in this country who are primary witnesses to the killing, or were part of the killing of political leaders consistently since 1963 that have allowed the elections to end up with people like Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. Mae Brussell has been on the air 9 years talking about the murder of these people. Charles Spears in Texas has been studying them. He sent out another letter this week, The Fourth Reich, Nazi Intrusion, Murdered for Control and Cover-Up. And he has 93 people on his list. I have a list of 130 people, witnesses just to the John Kennedy assassination. And you go down this list of people murdered, and every single one of them was for the political purpose of getting into office candidates such as you are seeing in 1980 who were part of the assassination teams. Now, I think that there will be more Mae Brussells and more Charles Spears, more people getting on the air, writing articles, writing to public officials. This whole group of dormant, quiet activity will sprout, and people will be forced to move. And when they're forced to move, I think we will get more alternative newspapers. They went out of business. The Berkeley Barb, the LA Free Press, the Realist will get small publishers coming out with books countering the multinational publications. I think a vote for Reagan is a vote for you to wake up and shake up. And I don't think that, as I say, the complacency that has been going on for all of these murders that affect specifically the electoral process really has to come. The complacency has to come to an end. I'm mean and I'm angry, I suppose, because we have let things get so bad. I'm not, I don't believe it's the end of the world, but I think there's going to be a lot of hard work to do to bring things around to a change, and there has to be a lot of blood spilled. No revolution ever came about through exchanging pencils and papers and paper clips or tape cassettes. Revolutions involved a lot of blood and a lot of killing and a lot of good people being killed in order to make those changes. And we need those changes in this country. We need to coexist with everyone. We need to stop making weapons. We need to stop looking the other way at these religious cults like the Hare Krishna, the Moonies, the various church cults that are gun smuggling, narcotic traffics, false passports, German citizenships, dual citizenships. We need to stop and look at these people with their funding. Reverend Moon's money came from Adolf Hitler. He made gunpowder in Korea. What business does he have buying up property, buying up our children's minds? How far can they go? Jonestown obviously wasn't enough because nobody yet has given a bean about that. The reaction of people is so minute to what Jonestown was or what these political assassinations were. It's going to take more blood than that. If it's not 900, it'll be 9,000, or maybe 90,000, or maybe 900,000, and maybe 9 million. It's going to take a lot of blood and energy, and it's going to take brains. And nothing is going to coagulate your energy or your emotions until you see King Ronald in the White House with his entourage. That will get you, if it didn't before. When you see him there and you realize this transition of what you've got in Washington, D.C., you'll be forced, I really feel, to make some changes. if Ronald Reagan had the image of balloons and jelly beans, Jimmy Carter had a different image. He came in with Greg Allman on his arm as if he loved rock music. He brought his Jewish lawyer from Atlanta, Mr. Lipsitch, and he had a black woman give the speech for him, a nomination speech. And we thought we had rock musicians, Jews and blacks, and this was going to be a party of the people. And he spun them off as nothing. He took on his multinational attorney, Lloyd Cutler. Barbara Jordan hasn't been heard from for years. She's literally in obscurity. Greg Allman was picked up on narcotics charges and faded away. And the narcotic dealers around the Allman brothers in Georgia are very much involved with Jimmy Carter and Billy Carter and the Vesco connections, the narcotic connections down there. The image of one was a liberal who brought in all segments of our society. He actually turned out to be handpicked by David Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission and Brzezinski at a meeting in London. They dressed him up as a PR job, and we fell for it, lock, stock, and barrel, until in October 1980 we have 60 ships in the Persian Gulf, and at any moment some crazy could kamikaze bomb one of them as an excuse for World War III. The real power between these various candidates is the Pentagon. It's the intelligence community. They're crazy people. They don't want to exist in peace. If you want peace, you're going to have to fight for it. And Jimmy Carter isn't necessarily going to bring it to you. Ronald Reagan, for sure, doesn't have a team that wants to bring it to you. And if you don't want to go bankrupt with the weapon systems, you're going to have to say, I've had enough. I'm not going to pay my taxes, or I'm not going to fight for you. I'm not going to do what you want me to. And the point about the 1980 elections, you go out and vote for whoever you want. But I know one thing. Jimmy Carter's links to the Middle East, to the terrorists, the CIA assassination teams, the Georgia assassination teams, is every bit as foul and rank as Ronald Reagan's. Reagan's linked to Paul Laxalt and organized crime and Lockheed and the user organization, and Lockheed is also big in Georgia. So I personally, for the first time, really am going to vote fascist, because they're both fascists, but one's an upfront fascist, and I feel that the sooner he's in, the sooner you will know what America really is, because it isn't different between the two of them, and we'll break the balloon and throw away the jelly beans and find out what's underneath and get on with the problem of making this country serve the people. That's what it's here for, to serve us and our needs, to build respect overseas, to stop putting in military dictatorships. And the more we put in like Somoza and the Shah, the more we'll fall, and then we'll learn to deal with them as friends and trade with them as friends and not dominate them. And so the higher they climb, the harder they'll fall. Reagan will put them up on their pedestals, and then it's up to the people to knock them out. That's all I have to say. Next week on Sunday will be the Sunday before elections here in Carmel, but it won't be for those of you who take the tapes elsewhere. So that's all I have to say, I believe, about the elections for 1980. You go out and do what you want, but I think we're in a very bad state, and we may as well recognize it for what it is. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
This is KLRB Carmel, Monterey, the No Bullshit Network.